What would you think if I told you there was once a woman born in chains who moved through the world as though she owned the keys to every lock? Her wrists bore the marks of bondage, yet her gaze carried the kind of unshakable calm that could unmake a man's certainty. She was called a slave, but the men who claimed to own her could not meet her eyes without feeling, deep in their marrow, that it was they who were bound. Bound by longing, bound by pride, bound by the fear of losing control. In the markets where bodies were bought like livestock, she stood among the desperate and the broken, and yet, she was neither. Her silence was not the silence of defeat, but of one who had no need to explain herself. She understood something most never grasp, that true freedom is not given by decree, nor taken by force. It is claimed within the mind, fortified by the discipline of thought, and guarded by the refusal to surrender one's inner self to the will of another. This was the philosophy she lived by, not written in books, but carved into her spirit by hardship, sharpened by the slow grind of humiliation. You might imagine that her master, a wealthy merchant seasoned in the art of power, would be the one in control. He purchased her expecting obedience, docility, the pliancy of someone with no other choice. But the moment she crossed the threshold of his home, something shifted. He could not name it at first. She served him without hesitation, yet never sought his approval. She moved with the grace of someone unafraid to vanish. Her presence unsettled him in a way he could not admit, for it is a dangerous thing when the object of one's ownership refuses to be owned in spirit. This is where the ancient Stoics would have understood her. Epictetus, himself born a slave, taught that a man may bind your limbs but never your will. And she embodied this truth so thoroughly that even those who thought they commanded her began to move around her with the subtle caution of those aware they are in the presence of something they cannot quite touch. She knew the merchant's game, that their worth was measured in coins and possessions, and so she never competed on their terms. Instead, she mastered the one currency that could not be traded, her self-command. In the quiet moments, when he watched her pour wine or tend to the household, the master began to feel the slow erosion of his authority. It wasn't her words, she spoke sparingly, but the weight of her detachment. He found himself imagining what it would take to make her need him. Yet he sensed that to try and force it would be to invite his own humiliation. Here was the paradox that gnawed at him. The more she seemed to belong to herself, the more he wanted her to belong to him. And the more he wanted, the more he was bound. For her, there was no battle to win. She did not seek to overthrow him, nor to seduce him. She lived as if her soul were beyond the reach of any man. And this was the power that kept him restless at night. The Stoics teach that desire is often the child of absence, that we hunger most for what we cannot possess. She understood this not as an abstract truth, but as a law of human nature. By guarding her mind, she made herself untouchable. By refusing to hinge her happiness on his favor, she made herself the axis around which his thoughts revolved. And so, the one called master began to measure his days by her smallest gestures, a glance, a moment of conversation, the rare curve of a smile. Without knowing it, he had entered into servitude to his own craving. He found himself altering his temper to avoid her quiet withdrawal, adjusting his dealings so as not to disturb the delicate equilibrium between them. In seeking to possess her, he had given her the reins of his own composure. The other slaves noticed it before he did. They moved differently around her, too, sensing that she carried a strange form of authority, one without command or threat, built entirely on the fact that she seemed immune to the forces that ruled their lives. And it is here, perhaps, that the true essence of her mastery revealed itself. She was not free in the eyes of the law, but she was free in the only way that mattered. She could not be bought twice, because her mind was not for sale. Most people never understand this kind of power. They believe influence comes from dominance, from control, from the visible levers of command. But her power was invisible, and therefore unassailable. The Stoics knew this secret. When you cease to fear loss, the world loses its hold on you. And when you live without needing the approval of another, you create the rarest form of attraction, the kind that is felt but cannot be claimed. The merchant began to sense the slow collapse of his own fortress. Though no walls had fallen, he was still the master in name, still the owner in the eyes of the market. Yet something in him was shifting, and it was not in his favor. His commands, once issued without thought, now carried hesitation. His eyes sought her reaction before the words even left his mouth. As though her silent judgment could either affirm or unravel his authority. He had not meant to place her on a pedestal, but there she stood nonetheless, above the reach of his power. Untouched by the currents that pulled at him daily. In the evenings, when the flicker of oil lamps cast shadows across the walls, he would catch himself watching her with a kind of curiosity he reserved for rare and dangerous things. It was not just beauty. Beauty fades under ownership. It was something else, something more dangerous, her self-possession. She seemed to move through the household as if it were merely a place she inhabited for now. As if the walls and locks could not truly contain her. He began to understand that while he might hold her body under his roof, her spirit roamed freely in realms where his name meant nothing. And here is the paradox that every Stoic would recognize, that the more a man seeks to control, the more he binds himself to the object of his control. Seneca wrote that, "He who is a slave to desire is the most wretched of slaves," and in this house, it was becoming clear who the true slave was. She did not need to speak it. Her composure was its own form of indictment. He tried, subtly at first, to test her resolve, a gift here, an unexpected kindness there, the sort of gestures designed to coax gratitude, to create a debt. But she received them all with the same unshaken demeanor, neither rejecting nor embracing them. Gratitude without submission, courtesy without attachment. In truth, she was practicing what the Stoics called apatheia, the state of being unshaken by either fortune or misfortune, unmoved by the rise or fall of circumstances. It was not coldness, but clarity. And clarity is dangerous to those who thrive on the intoxication of control. At night, when he lay awake, the merchant's mind replayed their exchanges. How she would answer his questions without rush or flattery. How she would look him in the eyes just long enough to show she was unafraid. Then turn her attention away as though dismissing the need for more. This, he realized, was a woman who could disappear from his life tomorrow without looking back. And that thought, that haunting awareness, was the hook in his flesh. He could not own what did not cling. In the marketplace of desire, detachment is the most expensive currency. She had it in abundance. And like all rare things, it drew bidders. He noticed other men, guests, traders, even rivals, stealing glances at her. She did not encourage it, yet she did not shrink from it either. She had no need to compete, because she knew her value was not something they could measure or take. This is the essence of what Marcus Aurelius urged, to stand rooted in one's nature. To require nothing from others that one cannot find within oneself. And so, the balance of power began its slow, invisible reversal. The master found himself making concessions, small at first, allowing her a voice in the household, deferring to her judgment on certain matters. It was not done consciously, but as a reflex born of respect, or was it fear? In truth, the line between the two had blurred. For what is fear, if not the recognition that another holds sway over something you cannot bear to lose? She, meanwhile, remained untouched by the drama unfolding within him. This was not because she was ignorant of it, on the contrary. She understood it better than he did. She had seen men unravel before, and she knew the pattern. She knew that the moment she began to seek his favor, the dynamic would shatter and she would be truly enslaved. So she did not seek it. Her worth was not a coin to be minted by another's approval. There is a lesson here for any woman listening. The one who guards her mind guards the seat of her power. A man may desire your body, your beauty, your company, but when he realizes he cannot touch your sovereignty, he begins to orbit you, and in that orbit, he is the one held in place. It was in this unspoken truth that she had, without effort, come to own her master. Continue, to receive the next part. Weeks turned into months, and the merchant's household settled into a rhythm that outsiders would have mistaken for order. But beneath the surface, the tide had changed. The other servants had begun to notice something uncanny. The master's tone shifted when addressing her. His anger softened in her presence. His decisions bent ever so slightly in her favor. It was as if she carried an invisible seal of authority, one that no one had bestowed yet everyone instinctively acknowledged. He told himself this was practicality. She was competent, efficient, unshakably calm, a wise master. After all, values the skills of those who serve him. But in quiet moments, stripped of pride, he could not deny the truth. He feared losing her. Not because of the labor she performed, others could do that, but because of the presence she carried. It was the same presence that had unsettled him the day she arrived. The same presence that made other men hesitate before meeting her gaze. She had become, in essence, the standard by which he measured himself. And this is where the chains shifted. In Stoic thought, true bondage is not the rope around your wrists but the need that coils around your heart. The merchant's need for her acknowledgement, her subtle approval, had become the leash he could not see but could feel tightening. She, on the other hand, understood the game perfectly. She knew the weight of silence. She knew the value of measured words, of meeting questions with answers that gave just enough but never everything. The power of mystery was hers not because she sought to manipulate, but because she refused to exhaust herself explaining. Epictetus would have recognized it immediately. If you wish to be loved, love yourself. She lived this creed without naming it. Her self-respect was not performative, it was the root from which all her actions grew. When guests came to the merchant's home, they often left speaking of her in hushed tones. Not for beauty alone, though she possessed it, but for the way she made them feel, as though they had been granted an audience with someone whose time and attention were precious. Even within the confines of slavery, some tried to charm her, others tried to test her. None succeeded in drawing from her anything she did not wish to give. For the master, this became a quiet torment. How could a woman with no wealth, no status, no freedom, command so much without lifting a finger? He began to study her, to search for cracks in the armor. He offered her luxuries, silk, perfumes, rare fruits. She accepted them with polite gratitude, then set them aside, never letting her delight become visible. He threatened withdrawal of favor, only to watch her remain composed, as though the loss of his approval would not diminish her life in the slightest. And so his mind circled the unanswerable question, what does she truly want? It was here that the merchant began to play by her rules without realizing it. He found himself strategizing for her happiness, rearranging his routines to avoid offending her, offering decisions for her input. These were not the acts of a man in control, they were the acts of a man seeking permission to maintain closeness. From a Stoic perspective, she had mastered the dichotomy of control in its purest form. She concerned herself only with what lay within her power, her thoughts, her choices, her self-conduct. Everything else, his moods, his judgments, the unpredictable turns of fortune, she treated as external, and therefore unworthy of her anxiety. This quiet discipline created an aura of inevitability around her. She could not be swayed by the tools that broke others, fear, flattery, bribery, or threat. And so, without a declaration, without even a conscious effort, she reversed the current. The man who had purchased her body found that his spirit had been purchased in return, not with coins, but with the rare currency of respect mixed with longing. And unlike her servitude, his could not be undone by a transaction. He could free her tomorrow and still remain her captive. To those who have never experienced this, it might seem impossible, but those who have felt it know. The most unshakable hold one person can have over another is not forged through force. It is formed in the moment you realize that their absence would hollow out something inside you that you cannot replace. One winter evening, as frost veiled the windows and the hearth's glow painted the walls in amber, the merchant sat alone, a goblet of wine untouched in his hand. The house was quiet, yet his mind was anything but. He had grown accustomed to the rhythm of her movements, the way her footsteps seemed to mark the hours better than any clock. And tonight, for reasons he could not explain, her absence in the room felt heavier than the cold air pressing in from outside. He remembered the day he bought her, the casual transaction that had seemed so unremarkable then. How easily he had believed that ownership was a matter of coin and signature. How arrogantly he had thought that possession ended the story. The truth was far more dangerous, it had only begun. For every day she had remained under his roof, she had redrawn the map of their connection, shifting the borders until his authority was no longer the dominant territory. She understood what he did not, that the truest form of mastery begins not with conquering others, but with conquering oneself. This was why she had no need to beg or scheme. She ruled herself with such quiet precision that those around her began, without noticing, to align themselves to her pace. Even the other slaves deferred to her, not out of fear, but out of the strange respect that comes from sensing someone has passed beyond the reach of humiliation. In her mind, there was no illusion about her circumstance. She was a slave in the eyes of the law. Yes, but not in the theater of her soul. The Stoics taught that the mind, once disciplined, becomes its own citadel, unbreachable by force. She had built hers stone by stone, sealing the gates against any master who would seek to define her worth. The merchant could enter her chambers, command her labor, summon her presence, but he could not breach the walls she had raised within. And here lay his torment. His world was built on the belief that power flowed in one direction, from the one who commands to the one who obeys. But she obeyed without surrender. She performed her duties with flawless competence, yet never in a way that suggested fear of displeasing him. It was service stripped of subservience, obedience without dependence, and it confused him more than defiance would have. He began to notice that when he spoke to her, he was measuring himself, gauging whether his words carried weight in her mind. He had never cared for such things before. With others, his commands were absolute. With her, they felt like propositions that might or might not earn her silent consent. And that unspoken possibility, that she could agree inwardly or withhold agreement entirely, bound him in ways no chain could. In time, he began to seek her counsel in matters beyond the household. Small things at first, the quality of a merchant's offer, the trustworthiness of a visiting trader. Her answers were always succinct, free of flattery, and startlingly accurate. She spoke as though she had no stake in the outcome, which made her words impossible to dismiss. He found himself relying on her judgment, then craving it, when she was not present to advise him. Decisions felt incomplete, as though missing a final seal. To an outside observer, it would seem absurd, a master leaning on the wisdom of a slave. But here was the essence of the inversion. She had made herself indispensable not by clinging, but by standing apart. She gave value without becoming bound to the giving. This was her genius, and it is the same principle the Stoics warned about, that to depend on anything external, even a person, is to forfeit a measure of your freedom. She never forfeited hers. And so, the merchant lived in a tension he could neither resolve nor escape. He desired her not for the warmth of her touch, though he imagined it, but for the fortress of her mind, which no coin could buy. He envied her steadiness. He longed for her approval. And without realizing it, he had ceded something far greater than ownership of her body. He had given her influence over his very sense of self. In the quiet of that winter night, he finally understood what had been gnawing at him for months. He had paid for her servitude, yet somehow, he was the one serving. Not in action, perhaps, but in thought, in desire, in the private negotiations of his mind. And once a man begins to measure his worth through the eyes of another, he has already placed himself in chains. Spring came early that year. The snows melted before their time, and with the thaw came the murmurs of change in the merchant's city. New laws whispered about in the marketplace. Talk of a ruler who sought to reform the buying and selling of human lives. In the streets, there was tension, but in the merchant's house, a quieter transformation had already taken root. And it was not dictated by any law. The merchant had grown to anticipate her presence the way a man anticipates the sun. She was not always in his sight, but the knowledge of her being within his walls lent his days an unspoken rhythm. And yet, this comfort was edged with unease, for he knew, though he tried to deny it, that if she were to leave, his world would not merely dim, it would collapse. This was the cruel irony he had never foreseen. The transaction that had made her his possession had also planted the seed of his dependence. She had been a slave in name, but he had become a slave in truth, chained to his desire for her attention, her approval, her rare and measured smiles. The more he sought to secure her, the further beyond his grasp she seemed to drift. She noticed it, of course. A woman attuned to human weakness could not miss it, but she did not wield this awareness like a weapon. She simply continued to live within her own boundaries, never bending herself into the shape of his expectations. In Stoic terms, she had mastered autarkia, self-sufficiency. Her joy was her own creation. Her calm was not a performance to appease him, but a discipline forged in the solitude of her own mind. And because she needed nothing from him, He began to give without being asked. Small liberties first, the freedom to move about the market without an escort. The right to choose her own tasks within the household. Then greater gestures, gifts of coin, fine clothing, the offer to arrange her sleeping quarters as she wished. He told himself these were rewards for her service. But deep down he knew they were bids for something he could not name without shame. Others began to notice the shift. Fellow merchants teased him behind his back, whispering that he was softening under the influence of a slave. But the truth was not softness, it was surrender. Not the surrender of authority in public affairs, but the more dangerous surrender that happens in the mind, where pride quietly concedes its throne to longing. She, however, seemed untouched by the politics of perception. When he granted her a favor, she accepted it without false humility and without inflation of ego. When he sought her counsel, she offered it plainly, and if he ignored it, she neither sulked nor sought to be proven right. Her detachment was not the brittle armor of indifference but the tempered steel of someone who had already rehearsed loss and found it survivable. This was the part he could not endure. She did not fear losing him. And that, more than her beauty or her mind, was the hook lodged deep within him. He realized that her freedom, the freedom she carried inside herself, was more seductive than any promise of devotion could ever be. Marcus Aurelius had written that the man who masters himself cannot be mastered by others. The merchant now lived in the shadow of this truth. He had tried to own her through law and coin, but she had owned herself through discipline and will, and in doing so, she had bound him in ways neither of them could have predicted. At times, he wondered if she even knew the full extent of her influence. But influence of this kind does not require awareness. It is the natural gravity of a soul that has no need to cling. And like all gravity, it pulls without effort, without plea, without promise. The merchant's pride told him he should break the spell, sell her, send her away, cut himself free from the invisible leash. But another part of him, deeper and quieter, feared that to lose her would be to lose the best part of himself. The part that rose toward her unshakable calm like a plant toward the sun. And so he stayed in the paradox, her master in the eyes of the law, her servant in the unseen corridors of the heart. The day the new decree arrived, the city shifted overnight. A scroll, sealed with the mark of the ruler, was read aloud in the marketplace. Certain slaves were to be freed, those purchased under questionable contracts, those whose service had exceeded a set number of years, those who could prove they had been unjustly taken. The law was narrow, but it was enough to send ripples through the merchant class. When the merchant returned home that evening, the weight of the scroll still in his thoughts, he found her in the courtyard tending to a small clay pot where green shoots had begun to pierce the soil. She looked up at him without fear, as she always did, and in that moment he knew, if she wished it, the law could release her. He expected to feel relief at the thought of her departure, as one might feel when the source of a quiet torment is finally gone. Instead, he felt something closer to dread, a slow, deep ache at the possibility of an empty space where her presence had been. He had told himself for months that he was her master. Now he understood the lie. She had been the fixed point in his shifting life, the axis around which his days turned. "You've heard the decree," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. She nodded. He waited for her to ask what it meant for her. But she did not. Instead, she returned her gaze to the sprout in her hands, as if its growth was of more importance than the fate of her own life. This, more than anything, undid him, for he realized that her calm was not feigned. She had already been free in the only way that mattered. The law could change her status, but it could not alter her essence. That essence had never belonged to him. He could have told her then, offered her manumission before the law required it, if only to prove to himself that he was not afraid. But something in him hesitated. To set her free on his own terms would be another form of control, another attempt to frame her liberty as his gift. And he knew she would see through it instantly. In the days that followed, the decree became the city's obsession. Merchants schemed, slaves whispered, markets adjusted to the coming shifts. In the merchant's house, life continued as if nothing had changed. She still carried herself with the same quiet poise, still spoke when she chose, still offered her thoughts without concern for whether they pleased him. But inside him, a storm was building. He realized he was no longer asking the question of whether she would stay or go. The real question was what would remain of him if she chose to leave. This was the point the Stoics had warned of, the moment when a man, having built his peace on something outside himself, feels the ground dissolve beneath him. Seneca had written, "To need nothing is divine, to need little is the closest a mortal can come." She had reached that state. He had not, and in that asymmetry lay the truth of their roles. He was dependent. She was not. When the official came to the house weeks later, parchment in hand, he confirmed what they both already knew: she was among those to be freed. There was no drama, no gasp of surprise. She accepted the news with the same serenity she brought to every moment, as though this outcome had always been written in the invisible ledger of her life. That night, the merchant drank alone. He thought of the chains that had bound her wrists when they first met, and of the ones he now felt tightening around his own heart. She had not broken them with rebellion or seduction, she had dissolved them with detachment, with the unyielding knowledge of her own worth. The next morning, she walked out of his house without ceremony. She did not look back, and it was in that moment, in the clean severing of her presence from his world, that he understood the full measure of her power. For while he had purchased her with gold, she had purchased him with nothing at all. The woman who owns herself will always own the man who cannot.